All right, guys, welcome back to Rho Sigma Tutoring. In this video, we're going to be doing an overview of the brain. So, first video I want to start off with here is going to be a classic one of sorts, and it's going to be this. So, what I'm going to draw here is a coronal or frontal cross section of the brain, and it's going to be roughly right there in the middle, roughly. So we're going to draw the cerebral hemispheres and then the temporal lobe, and then that's going to be just a cutout because we haven't quite hit the brainstem, so there's nothing there. Okay, so that's probably good there. So, and then I should probably draw the hemisphere, the temporal lobe a little bit bigger. That's probably good. Okay, so first thing I'm going to draw here, and we'll talk about this in just a minute. And then, whoop, whoop. All right. All right, so what you see in this picture, and this is very busy, but this is what we're getting into. So, what you really need to remember is that the outside of the brain here is made up of gray matter. And then the cerebrum, so what are the differences between gray and white matter? What are they? It is that, so gray matter is where the neuronal cell bodies are, and then white matter that's where the myelinated axons are. So when you're looking at the brain, the outside, or the cortex, is going to be gray matter, and then the brain also has regions of deep gray matter. And that's what these circles and then this triangle looking things are. The black, those are going to be your ventricles. So let's talk about those first. And then, of course, in between the internal gray and then the cortex gray is going to be your myelinated axons. And they're going to be going, connections in the brain, and then the brain going down to the body, and then the body coming up to the brain. All kinds of cool stuff. So let's start with the lateral ventricles. So they're right here. The lateral ventricles, there is one in each hemisphere, and then the lateral hemispheres, they're going to drain into the third ventricle. So, you got the lateral ventricles, one in each hemisphere, and I think this model shows that pretty well. Let me pull apart the transverse cut. So there we go. So you'll see the blue right here, and then that would be the occipital horn or the posterior horns there, and that is going to be your lateral ventricles. The lateral ventricles are then going to drain, the cerebrospinal fluid are going to drain into the third ventricle. And that's odd because we've only talked about one other ventricle before this. Why are we talking about a third? Well, and that's because we have two lateral ventricles, one on each hemisphere, and then it drains into the third. Okay, that makes sense. And then the reason why you don't see any other ventricles is because the fourth ventricle, so one, because we have two laterals and then a third, and that's dead in the center or midline. The fourth ventricle is going to be located in the brainstem. So since we're not in the brainstem, we're only looking at the cerebrum. We can't see it. So that's all we can talk about there. So that's the lateral ventricles out of the way. But the flow of cerebrospinal fluid, so lateral ventricles, they flow into the third ventricle. It flows into the fourth ventricle. And then from there, there's two different places it could go. It can go through the central canal of the spinal cord, or it can get cycled through the outside of the cerebrum through the meninges. Specifically, I believe it's the subarachnoid space that the cerebrospinal fluid flows through, and then it nourishes the cerebrum from there. Which is important because that's where the gray matter, the outer gray matter is. Okay, so that gets us to another thing we could talk about. So the meninges. So what are the meninges? So they are 3 different layers of the central nervous system. It covers not only the brain, but it also covers the spinal cord. And then from superficial to deep, they go in this order. So I like to remember it as DAP, D-A-P. So you have the dura mater. You have the arachnoid mater. And then you have the pia mater. And then that subarachnoid space that I was talking about, well, where do you think the subarachnoid space is? It would be right in between the arachnoid and the pia. Subarachnoid space. So that's where the cerebrospinal fluid flows through to nourish the outside of the brain. And then, of course, there's a bony covering superficial to the meninges. And if we're talking about the brain, that would, of course, be the skull or the cranium. And then if we're talking about the spinal cord, that would be the vertebra. And just to mention it here, there are 7 cervical vertebrae. There are 12 thoracic vertebrae, 5 lumbar vertebra, and then for the sacrum, it is 5 fused vertebra, and then the coccyx is 4 fused vertebra. So yeah, that covers that. That covers the meninges and the bony coverings. Okay, so we have the lateral and the third ventricle. What is this big ball-looking thing? Right in between right under the third ventricle. That is going to be your thalamus. And you're going to need to know a lot about the thalamus, but for right now, I want you guys to think of it as it is the processing to get to the cerebrum. So if you are sensory information and you have to get into the cerebrum, whether it's the frontal or parietal or the temporal or occipital, you have to go through the thalamus. And something that I heard that I kind of liked, it's the I think it's the TIA, or I've never flown, but the people that do that check your luggage and all that, that's them. That's the thalamus. Okay, and then the next part, so that's the thalamus, we got that covered. The next are all these guys right here. So collectively, these guys on both sides are called the basal ganglia. Now, the basal ganglia is actually a very confusing term because ganglia, the definition of ganglia or a ganglion is a collection of peripheral nervous system neuronal cell bodies. But the thing about it is this is the central nervous system. And so a more accurate name would be the basal nuclei, but that's beside the point. So the different names here, we have the caudate nucleus. So we'll label this guy number 1. So we have the caudate nucleus. And then we have this part. So I like to call this the pizza. And then the pizza, the crust of the pizza is going to be your putamen. And then the actual part of the pizza that has the sauce, that is going to be called your that lentiform nucleus doesn't sound right. That's the globus pallidus. Well, I'll explain that here in a minute. Globus pallidus. And you're like, well, Nick, I saw you add a little division point in the pizza. What's that all about? And that's just because the one that is closer to the crust, that is technically called the globus pallidus externus. And then the one that is the tip of the pizza is your globus pallidus internus. But let's try not to get too carried away. And then the last one here, that is going to be your subthalamic nuclei. So it's going to be right there, your subthalamic nuclei. And that's the same thing as the subthalamus, but the subthalamus anatomically is part of the diencephalon or the thalamus, because the thalamus is also part of the diencephalon. We'll talk about that here in a minute, or in another video. But the subthalamic nuclei functionally is part of the basal ganglia. And there's another part of the basal ganglia that is located in the midbrain. However, it's not pictured, but that is the substantia nigra. And that is going to be really important when we talk about Parkinson's disease, but we're just not quite there yet. So yeah, that's the basal ganglia. That covers that for the most part. However, something you guys do need to know, there's a different collection of names that you could be called, that this could be called. So if you're combining the caudate nucleus and the putamen, that is called the stritium. And I don't know how to spell this, so let me make sure I spell it right. Always fact check my spelling. And then if you're talking about the putamen and the globus pallidus, or the pizza, that is the lentiform nucleus. That was that name I said a little bit ago. So that is the lentiform nucleus. So yeah, a little confusing, but that's what it is. And then collectively, these guys are the basal ganglia. And then not pictured because it's in the midbrain is the substantia nigra. Okay. Let's see, is there any other specific thing I wanted to talk about? Okay, I talked about the bone and the meningeal coverings, the ventricles and cerebrospinal fluid. Let's talk about more so the divisions. And I think the best way to kind of go through the divisions, it makes it a little bit more complicated, but I think it is the best way of covering it just because, just because. So let's see here. It is going to be embryological development. So starting at around 3 to 4 weeks, this is what your nervous system looks like. And if you've watched this lecture before, then what I'm about to draw is going to be the bomb pop. So there's the red, and then of course the bomb pop, the middle is white, and then the bottom is the blue. It's the best part. You can fight me on that. So what are these different things? What are these different parts called? So the red is the proencephalon. Is it pro or pros? Yeah, the proencephalon. And then all of these end in encephalon, so I'm not going to write that again, save time. And then this is the mesencephalon, and then we have the rhomencephalon. Okay? And then at the bottom here, this is going to be the neural tube, and it's going to stay the neural tube. But this is what eventually develops into your spinal cord. But we'll carry that through. Another name for all of these is, so this is the forebrain. This is the midbrain. And then this is the hindbrain. And I'll put that in parentheses there. Okay, so, that makes sense. That's not too horribly bad. But the thing about it is at around 5 weeks, or by 5 weeks, this is all going to differentiate. So the proencephalon, or the forebrain, is going to divide into two. the mes or midbrain is going to stay as one, and then the ROM or the hindbrain is going to split into two, and the neural tube stays the same. So what does this look like? So it's going to turn into almost like hemispheres, okay? And then your midbrain, and then your ROM, and we'll do two little bumps there. And then your neural tube, so big, little. Okay. Like I said, not an artist, but I'm doing my best here. So we got the red, and then we got the white, and then we got the blue. So we got blue there, and then blue there. Okay, so what are these guys called? Well, up here, and then I actually forgot one little part here. I'll make the mes a little smaller. So sorry about that. So boop, boop. You know, I'm not the best drawer in the world. Never have I claimed. Okay, so that's what we got. So this part is going to be the tail encephalon, and then we have the diencephalon, and then the mesencephalon, you know, it stays the mes, and then we have the metencephalon, and then the myencephalon. And I'm not gonna lie, mes, met, my is always hard for me to remember, so you know, you're gonna have to go back and look at that. So mes, met, my. So if you know a guy named Mes, you could say mes, met, my mom or something. I don't know. Well, whatever you have to do to remember something, I guess. Okay, so this is around 5 weeks. So what kinds of things does this develop into? So you already heard me say earlier in the video that the diencephalon, these guys develop into the thalamus, and then all the other thalami. So you have your subthalamus, you have your epithalamus, subepi, and then there's another one. I can't quite remember what it is, but that's what it develops into. And then the telencephalon, these are going to be your cerebral hemispheres. Okay, so the cerebral hemispheres, those are, you know, pretty important. They're also going to develop into your basal ganglia, so the basal ganglia, and then the lateral ventricles. So think, if it's anything up top, it's, except the thalamus, oh, the hypothalamus. How could I forget about the hypothalamus? I mean, come on now. But yeah, and then it also includes the third ventricle. So yeah, so stuff up top, and then more of the stuff like the thalami, and then the third ventricle, just because the thalami and the third ventricle, I mean, they're right with each other. And then the mesencephalon, well, I wonder what that develops into. The midbrain, duh. I mean, we were already calling it the midbrain. But it also develops into the cerebral aqueduct. And remember that is what connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle, and that's going to be what is down here. So the metencephalon, that is going to develop into the pons, the cerebellum, and the fourth ventricle. And then the only thing that we haven't talked about is the is the and the only thing we haven't listed is the medulla. So what you realize is, you know, the midbrain is what you kind of start off with, and it stays consistent. So if you remember that the mesencephalon is the midbrain, and everything above it is, you know, the things that are above it, duh, and then the things that are below it are the things that are below it. Which sounds obvious, but if you don't look at this stuff, it's not going to make sense. And then, of course, the neural tube stays the neural tube, and then it becomes the spinal cord. Yeah, I feel like that about covers it for this one. There will be another video coming out covering like the models, and I feel like that is going to be very beneficial. So keep your eye out and look for that one. All right, thank you very much.